All right, and welcome everyone to another session of Danish Sound Cluster webinars. This webinar is very interesting, and actually it's very different than what we normally focus on. Still audio, of course, audio, sound, but it's in the games reality. So it's a very interesting topic, especially for people like me and a lot of people here in Denmark. They know a lot about hearing aids and acoustics and all that, but they don't necessarily know much about audio in games. What does that mean? How important it is for the games to make the game a much better experience and all that. So that's why we have these three amazing guests today here to tell us more about that, about the process, about the experience of working in that, and about different features on that as well. So I'd like to say at least that we have three amazing guests today, and we have Simon Stenhove, who is a sound designer at Massive Entertainment, Ubisoft. And then we have Rob Bridget, who is a manager of sound at PlayStation. And we have Christian Svane, who is a senior sound designer at IO Interactive. They all have complete different experiences, different also time that they've been doing this. So they'll tell you more details about themselves. Welcome, guys. The process here is that we will start with Simon, who's going to introduce most of us who have no clue about audio in games. Will introduce us a little bit into that, and then into his experience of being in this field. And then Rob will get into more detail of the whole process of how that works. And then Christian will talk about a very specific part in this sector, which is the haptics. But yeah, I'll leave the details to you guys. And I just want to say that if anyone has any questions at any point, there is a button on the bottom. You can write your question there at the Q&A instead of the chat. And then we will take it at the end. So there will be 25 minutes presentation for each person. And then we'll take the Q&A at the end. So without further ado, we're going to start with Simon. So if you want to unmute and share.
Yeah, I do want to do that.
Go ahead. It's all yours.
Thank you, Pedro. Thanks for having me also. As you mentioned, I've called this talk the first time I realized making sounds for games is complicated. And what I want to do is to talk about a story of the first game I ever worked on. In that game, I want to dive into a very specific challenge that's been haunting me ever since, because I never really got to solve it the way I wanted to. And then to sort of process that trauma a bit, I want to talk about what I would do today if I were to solve it again. And hopefully I'll get to highlight some challenges that are unique to game audio sound design that you might not think about if you're not used to working in interactive media. So yeah, if you don't know anything, hopefully you'll learn something. If you're already a game audio professional, maybe you just stay for the entertainment and you brew up some tough questions for later. So before I start, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Simon. I have a bachelor's degree in sound design from Sonic College in Denmark. This is my face. I'm not used to doing Zoom presentations, so I didn't know if you could see my face, but here it is. And then I've been working in game audio for around 5 years now. Started out at CCP Games in Iceland for 2.5 years, and then currently working for Massive Entertainment in Malmö. But before all that, I was still in sound design school working on my first game project. It looked a bit like this. And it was a game about this blue character who went on a journey and he met a baby goat. and they were going to this power plant in the distance. And they were going there to restore power so the blue character could go home and play video games again. And I found a little trailer from the game that I wanted to show you just so you get a better idea about what kind of game it was. So this was part of the sound design school. So me and one other student had 6 weeks in total to make all of the sounds, all of the music for the game. And it was a game that took around 1.5 hours to complete. So it was like a really tight deadline. So mostly I just remember like a stressful haze when I think back to those 6 weeks. But then there's one memory that stands out the most, which is the tipping bridge, I call it. Imagine that you're in the desert and you're controlling a blue character and a baby goat, here represented by an icon I found in PowerPoint. And then you meet this big old rusty metal bridge that sort of functions a bit like a seesaw. So as you walk over it, it tips over and into the sand. Yeah, and I thought, no problem, I'll make a sound for that, do some metal clicks and then trigger it when the bridge starts moving. And that worked okay. It sounded like this. Which was pretty decent, I thought. Then what I hadn't thought about was that, I kept testing this a little bit, and I quickly ran into a case that I called the slow mover, which sounded like this. Where obviously the timing's wrong, because I just made the sound, one sound that triggers when it starts moving, and then sort of expecting players to just like run over that bridge. But you could obviously, people decide how fast they move themselves. So that's an issue. And it wasn't the only issue I found either. So what happens here is that, the sound plays every time the bridge starts moving, instead of just playing once in the beginning like I dreamt it would. But every time it sort of stops halfway, it triggers again. And it's the same, fixed length sound, and everything sort of becomes a bit messy. And that's sort of all I remember from that haze. And I don't think I ever fixed it, which is why it's been haunting me. I think we're just too busy. You need to make some music as well. So to sort of process that a little bit, I thought about what would I do today? And the main issues, this thing with the fixed timing doesn't work, playback rule isn't ideal, then what I think I need to do would be to think more about building a system that can play back the sounds sort of depending on the inputs we get from the game, instead of just thinking, I need to make a sound. So what would this system need to do? What do I need from it? I want to play a sound when when the bridge first starts moving, just to give that initial, feedback to the player that you're like, this thing is going to move. And then I also want to play a sound, when it hits the sand in the desert in the end, just to mark a nice clunky finish to it. And then I know that I want to play sounds in between. So like after it starts and until it ends. But then we don't know how long that's going to be. So we'll have to make it a loop that can play forever, if that's what people want. If they take half an hour to walk over that bridge, then it needs to play the loop for half an hour. So to achieve this, I've made an action plan, which is I want to split the original sound into 3 parts, a start and a loop and an end. And then I want to create some new playback rules for each of those sounds. So we make a system that can set the sounds together in a way that makes sense. So here is a picture from my DAW. I work in Reaper usually. This is how the sound looks like when it's fixed length. Then I want to split it out into a starting sound, which in this case sounds like this. A little clunky. And then a looping sound, which technically could be infinite, but in this case, it's only 10 seconds. Yeah, creaky. And then we have an ending sound. Sounds a bit like this, which is a combination of some sort of metal impact and then try to put in some sort of sand sweetener because it sort of hits into the sand. There's a few layers in there. And then the rules I would need to set up for each of those sounds would be, first up, to only play the start sound when the bridge first starts moving, to avoid getting those, you walk up on it and then it stops, and then when it starts again, it will trigger the sound again. I don't want that. Second rule would be play a loop alongside the start sound. And then a third rule would be to remember to stop that loop when it ends. And the end sound should play when the bridge impacts the ground. Good. So that's 4 rules. And so now we have like 3 sounds and 4 rules. And then the slow mover would sound like this. Which I feel like is okay. It works. But then still the sort of stop and go version isn't ideal. Because it sort of, it keeps creaking even when the bridge is standing still. And that feels weird. So I thought we're going to need to do a 3rd iteration of this, where we can sort of modify the volume of the creaking to the speed of the bridge movement. So you could say that there's a need for the speed of the bridge movement in this case. And usually this sort of is represented in a graph where you sort of map your volume value to the speed, and then it could look something like this. So basically just say, the faster you move, the louder the sound is. And if the bridge isn't moving at all, no sound. So with that, it would sound something like this. Which I think is okay. It works, sort of. So to sum up a little bit from these 3 iterations, we sort of went from the original Stressful Haze version of just 1 sound, 1 rule. It didn't really work, but it worked if players just like ran over that bridge. That was fine. No one would notice. But then 2nd iteration where we said like split the sound up into 3 sounds and we added some more rules, works no matter how fast the player walks over. But then the third iteration with the sort of, using the movement speed to set the volume, I think will work for many more cases. So I've put here like 3 sounds, 4 rules, 1 RTPC. RTPC is short for real-time parameter control, but I couldn't fit that into the green heart. And I'm not sure what it's called that's what it's called in Wise, at least, that we use as a middleware. I don't know what it's called in Fmod or something else. Maybe people in the chat will know. Of course, we could also keep iterating on this, because why not? And if I were to do that, probably look into like doing different intensities of the end sound. So the faster the bridge sort of slams into the ground, maybe you want a bigger sound on that. And if it's just softly touching down, you want to build the system so it can play a softer sound in the end. And then you probably want to do different debris sweeteners on that end sound as well, because usually in games when we have this bridge, they would sort of put it all over the place in the world. So like sometimes it impacts into sand, sometimes it's going to impact into grass or onto metal, and then we need to be able to like swap around the sound to make it fit. And then maybe a third idea could be to swap out the looping sound based on the speed as well. So you could have a more creaky, rattly sound if it's moving slowly, and maybe something more tonal when it's moving fast. There's a million options for like making cool details. But sometimes you need to know when to stop iterating also, which can be the hardest part. And I know I need to stop talking. So I wanted to zoom out in the end and think about like what this case taught me about game audio back then. And I think I like to say sound is not a sound, which doesn't make sense, but it needs to be understood in the way that you just don't just make a sound for something. You need to make a set of sounds and then let the game sort of put them together again into the final sound. If that makes sense. Sort of compose the final sound. And then a lot of the time, making sounds for games is about designing systems as well, like setting up a bunch of rules and testing out and see what works, what doesn't work, which is sort of the third point, that you end up iterating a lot. And even if you think you've got a good solution, you test it out, you play the game, see how it feels, find all the issues, and then you iterate on it again. And for every iteration, I feel like there's new issues popping up that you need to fix. So those are like the little 3 stars, and that's pretty much all I had to say. I just added my email to the last slide. If people have any questions or anything, you can send me an email. And then I think that's it, Pedro. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. That was very visual, very understandable. Lovely example. You already have questions, but we'll take them at the end. So then
Okay,
we can.
I'll stick around.
Yeah, you'll stick around. Good. Maybe you can stop sharing, and then we can go on to Rob.
Great. Yeah.
So whenever you like, just you can start.
All right.
Awesome.
Great. Yeah, that was that was amazing, Simon, because it's the brilliant order in which to do these presentations, because I'm going to talk perhaps a little bit about how we systemize that in terms of game development. But yeah, it's perfect information. But I'll start with an introduction to myself. I'm Rob Bridget. I've been working in video game sound probably for about 22 years in total. I first started working in sound. Before that, I attended Bournemouth University. There's a master's degree program there, which I think was kind of one of the first of its kind, maybe in the world, of like sound for the moving image. So I was in like the first or second year of that program, sort of figuring out what a sound designer was for film and for like on-screen media. There were no video game sound courses around back then in 1998. So yeah, film sound seemed to be a sort of interesting way in to that sort of, to thinking about sound for moving images at least. And so yeah, video game sound was something that I hadn't intended to get into. It sort of happened by accident. I was, looking for entry points into the film sound world when some colleagues that I shared a house with at Bournemouth, some animators they got work at a video game developer in the UK at Climax Studios, and they contacted me because they needed a sound person to come and work at the studio. They didn't really know even what to call it. I think the original job title was something like audio engineer, which was about as generic as you could get for that kind of role. And I managed to get that job, and soon sort of started to realize that it was everything to do with audio and to do with sound was my responsibility. And we didn't have any tools either to sort of implement sound in the games at that point. There were some very basic sort of pieces of software for triggering sounds, but even that was like so basic that I had to work and collaborate with the programmers on that team to sort of create sort of more interesting ways and more quality focused ways of adding sound to those games. So yeah, that was that first job that I got was around 2001, and yeah, since then I've realized that job that I was doing was kind of what you would call an audio lead or even an audio director at this point. So yeah, not having that terminology was pretty interesting. I think at one point I insisted that I was called a sound designer rather than an audio engineer, because I'd sort of read a lot about how Walter Murch had sort of coined that term, and to sort of better describe what the role of sound is in the process of making games. So yeah, that beginning point, being able to go through and try and figure out how to get sounds in games, how to get even music triggering in games, and dialogue, of course, as well. That was all part of a very long and stressful journey. So in 2003, I left Climax Studios to go and work in Vancouver at a video game company called Radical Entertainment, and they had their own game engine. They had their own audio engine as well that they'd written in-house, and they'd solved a lot of the things that I was struggling to sort of do. So that was really good, because for the first time I was working as an audio director as a title, but also with a big team who were sort of separated out into more understandable responsibilities. Like there was an entire audio programming team to support the tools and the sort of triggers and things we needed in the game engine. So that was a very amazing sort of learning experience as well, where we were able to think about the games a little less technically. We were still very heavily worried about the technology and how things would trigger and how things would be able to ship in the game. But we had realized that we could be freed up to think a bit more about how the sound would actually arrive at the player's ears and what the experience would be for the player. So that started to become more of a immediate concern for that audio director role, was to figure out more about the aesthetics, more about the feeling and the tone of the sounds. So yeah, that movement started around that time for me. So I was working at Radical Entertainment for about 9 or 10 years. They were mainly open world games, which it's a genre of video game that's essentially allows you as a player character to kind of go anywhere within a particular world. a particular map, and sort of encourages you to do anything in that world. And a lot of the fun and the sort of entertainment in those kind of games is to, just do crazy stuff and jump off high buildings and you can do anything. So as a sound designer or audio director, you have to, a little bit like Simon was saying, you have to figure out what all the things that are possible to do in that world are, and that takes a long time because the game is continually being built and designers are continually adding new things for you to do in that world. So you kind of have to have this approach of, start somewhere, maybe put in like a basic ambience or something like that, just so that there's some sound supporting everything. And then, as Simon was saying, like that thinking process starts to go much deeper over time once you react to things that are on screen, and you realize you need all these systems and all the systemic ways of not only playing sounds but loading them into memory, having them ready to play, and then once the thing is not available anymore because you're across the other side of the world, flushing that out of the memory and getting rid of it. So there's this continual idea of sound in open world of sounds like loading in and being ready to play, playing, and then being unloaded to make room for the new sounds that are coming in. So that was a really interesting sort of technical thing to solve as well. So this idea of streaming sounds in from a disc, a lot of the music we would stream, some of the dialogue we would stream as well, anything that didn't need to be absolutely frame accurate and synchronous, we were able to stream that because you'd have a little bit of latency as you found the sound file on the disc and it played. So for things like music cues, some music cues anyway, like immediate frame accurate playback wasn't so important, so you could stream those things. And of course, back in those days, I think we were working on like the PlayStation 2 and the early Xbox. The streaming bandwidth from the disc that you'd put into the console was quite limited as well. So you were sort of limited to, I can't remember, like 8 streams, simultaneous streams for all the sounds that you wanted to play. But you also had this bit of memory that you could allocate to preloaded sounds. So it's a very small amount of memory. So you had to think very hard and like prioritize the sounds that you always need to have loaded. Like for example, your kind of player Foley sounds, the footstep sounds that you continually need to make for the character as they move through the world. Or like the user interface sounds. Anytime a player presses pause, there's a menu that shows up, and even though they're very small sounds, they still need to be preloaded and ready to play. So there's a big sort of prioritization process that goes on there. So you're continually trading off all these sort of things. And so as technology improved and as the console generations increased, so did the memory. And a lot of those issues have sort of gone away now. They're still there, but we don't really consciously think about them as much as we used to. That can be very dangerous, actually, where like if you have an audio engine like Wwise, you can quite easily freely go into Wwise and add tens of thousands of files and substructures and like random containers containing like hundreds of variations, and you can go on and on and on, and it won't stop you. Like in my old company, a programmer would knock on my door and stop me from doing that at some point, and it would usually happen fairly quickly. So now you can sort of get away with a lot more. You can hide it. So yeah, I guess the point there is optimization is now a thing that you have to really sort of figure out later on. But I think game development is a very sort of collaborative and team-based way of working. So it isn't just a sound designer off making stuff on their own. They're doing that in collaboration with an art team, a tech team, and so on, and a bigger sound design team as well at this point. So there's often a sound designer has a sound lead or an audio lead above them who is probably more responsible for coming up with those systemic ideas and some of the rules about how those sounds will be put into the game. So, and then above that is perhaps an audio director or a technical audio director who have sometimes split responsibilities for those separate areas of the game as well. And so after working at Radical Entertainment, I moved over to a company called Clockwork Fox, which was in St. John's in Newfoundland. That was a very small mobile company. So I was able to work on some very sort of different style games, a lot smaller, a lot more kind of easier to manage. And I had audio tools at that point. I had Fmod, I had Wise, and we were working in a commercial game engine this time as well. So that world of, the third-party commercially available tools and tool sets is now, I would say, the predominant way of companies making games and making content for those games, and for sound designers and composers and dialogue designers to work with content. So I worked there for a couple of years, and then moved back to AAA development at Eidos Montreal, where I worked on games like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, very big story-driven games with a lot more focus on narrative and storytelling, things like that. So the thing that Simon touched on there was really critical and key to that way of working in video games, which is this idea of iterative work. And the important thing to sort of understand is it's not just the sound team that has to go through that iteration, but the seesaw thing in the desert example was really great, because Simon walked us through that process of how to approach putting a sound on that. I think what you also should understand is that seesaw probably showed up in that game not in a finished state where it was like that's the final version of the seesaw the first time you see it, but it would have been like a very rough version of it with no texture on it and perhaps no physics at first, and then another version would show up with perhaps more detail on it, or maybe it was longer, or like the dimensions had changed completely, and that process would continue as well. So I think that those other departments, that art department, the lighting departments, and all those, the VFX teams, all are doing their own thing as well. They're animating, they're iterating, they're receiving feedback, they're doing new versions of it. So the question sort of arises at some point, is that how does audio work in that sort of world where everything is changing underneath you all the time? And so we've come up with this shorthand, this sort of quality driven shorthand. It's called like the quality L level scale, but it's just it's a way of communicating with other disciplines on a game team predominantly, but also within our own sound teams. So at any point in development, we can, at any milestone, at a particular milestone, we can sort of target one of these L levels for our, the quality that we want to review on screen, and the process, the phase of development that we're in at any point. So this could apply to a very short schedule for a mobile title, or it could apply equally to a very big AAA team. And essentially, I'll walk through each one of these, but this is and if you can sort of screenshot this, that's fine. You can sort of read it later. I won't go into all the detail, but yeah, essentially it's these 4 quality levels from L0 to L4, and they sort of walk through the different phases of game development. So this is L0 is essentially what happens before the team's like fully assembled and working on it. There's usually a small group of like directors on a AAA game, at least, who are thinking about what the game is that they're going to make. They'll create some style guides and some design principles. They'll create some inspirational material for either investors or for the team members to look at and to become inspired and understand the vision of the game. So sound can be involved in that stage early on as well, as sort of supporting that iterative work in the concept phase, which is really, it's kind of an exciting place to be for sound, actually, because you can come up with almost like sound only ideas at that stage, and you can really help to sell that vision using sound, music, and all that stuff. So once you have that vision, the next part is to sort of try to get things on screen in the game engine itself. So that's where everything moves to the game engine, or to the console, or to the PC, and we enter this sort of L1 to L3, well, to L4 world, where we're doing first passes of stuff. So the Seesaw iterations in its very first, most rough version. Animation's very rough and very early. But the basic principle of this L1 phase is to sort of just prove functionality and try and get something on screen that gives feedback when you're playing the game on the controller, that you sort of understand the mechanics of what you're supposed to do. So the idea of this first step is to sort of get an approval on a feature. So let's say it's the Seesaw or a particular kind of navigation. There'll be a very rough version of that in there. And this is where sound also, I think, plays a key role, because you still want to support that feature with some sound feedback. So actually the first version of the Seesaw sound that Simon gave there would have been a perfectly acceptable L1 version of a sound, for me at least, as an audio director. So I think, because you get initial feedback and you understand, okay, cool, it's going to make this kind of rusty, squeaky sound. We like the tone of that. It fits in the world. That's great. So yeah, getting that feedback in there is really important. It doesn't need to, if we say something's L1, I have this like director's lens kind of row here. Anyone who's reviewing that content is just thinking about the functionality of the sound. They're actually not even thinking about the identity and the tone of it yet. We just want to analyze the feedback. So the identity and tone comes once that feature's sort of been improved and it's gone through a second iteration or a third iteration, and we're now focused on more the identity of those sounds and the identity visually as well, I guess, if there's a L2 visual phase as well. So if it were a Star Wars kind of game or something like that, you would expect those sort of rough placeholder sounds to now have that, like that Star Wars blaster sound or the lightsaber sound or something iconic to it. If it's a new IP, this L2 period tends to take a long time, because you're basically trying to put what was in the vision document on screen, and that can take a lot of iterations in itself. Sometimes you don't quite know how to put that vision on screen, so you're learning how to do that as well. So that's the sort of second pass, the second lens that we look at for L2 is, are we getting the feeling of this world, this unique world, and is that coming across on screen and through the sound as well? So again, still quite rough, not enough variations there, not enough systems there, but we're happy with the tone and with the sound itself. So that moves us to L3, which is then very polish focused. We're adding in, the systems and the variations. We're making it feel really good. By this time, the visual side and the animation side has been refined as well. So we're working with a feature which is fairly stable. In L1, the stability of those features is so much so that you can't even have time to polish that stuff, because actually in L1, features are even getting cut from the game. New things are getting added, and that can happen on a daily basis. So the amount of iteration declines as you go through this L-level process as well. And so once you reach an approved L3, you're reviewing that L3 stuff to make sure the emotion's there, that the shape of the experience is there, it's reactive, everything feels good, it's on tone and on identity, the feedback's already there. Once you reach that stage, it's kind of the end of production at that point. So this is usually where a game will ship, but one thing that we've really tried to push for is to have a small amount of polish time at the end, which is almost exclusively for audio. So there's optimization is happening in that stage as well. The animation team's usually sort of gone home at that point and is on another project, for example. So there is often a little bit of time where you can polish that stuff. And we're not making huge changes to the audio in that L4 phase, but we can focus on what you typically call a mix in a sort of post-production sound world. So we can take time there to really sort of polish the interrelationships between those sounds at that point. And so yeah, just to sort of move a little bit into that last area, mixing. It is an area that we've traditionally struggled with. Like in the early days, we were just focused on playing sounds, trying to get sounds to play back, and all those memory concerns that I was talking about. Whereas now the emphasis is much more on, we're able to play so many sounds and so many different dialogue cues and music cues and ambiences, that we've really now got to start really thinking about what's the most important thing for the player to hear at any moment. Because if we just prioritize everything, it's a cacophony. We're capable of playing so much stuff back that it's just it very quickly becomes unintelligible to a player. So mixing has become a really important part of that, and it's something that we do all the way through that process. We'll have an L1 mix, an L2 mix, and so on. But the critical part is that L4 mix for sure. And then this is sort of typically how we think about sound, the different pieces of the audio in a game reaching the audience. But the more we sort of have looked into this, there's not just a final mix. There's also a pre-mix for each of these categories: cinematic, sound, music, dialogue. We'll need pre-mixing, so each category of sound is consistent within itself before we reach that final mix step. And then even the pillars, like the Foley for the game, will have a pre-mix, the ambience, and so on. And then with even just the integration step now, it includes mix decisions that are, kind of important to that. So this is a sort of new emerging field in game audio. We're still on the sort of we're still learning a lot about it. It's a broad topic. There are the broad things we can talk about with mixes, but there's also a game-to-game thing there as well. So every game is going to treat its mix differently because every game has different information in it. But yeah, I just did want to sort of break out that last little section there. So yeah, I think in summary for this section at least in my 20 plus years of developing game audio and being involved in it, we've seen a lot of technical changes. We've been freed up, and work is less frustrating than it used to be, but it still has a lot of frustrations of different kinds. So it's less about technological frustrations, if you can believe it, and more about collaborative and iterative kind of work. So I think that's a lot of our thinking is moving to thinking about games less as technology, at least from a director's viewpoint, and more as an entertainment medium, like telling stories and putting experiences on screen. I think that's what's driving a lot of the thinking about video game sound at the moment. So yeah, I will leave it there, and we'll hopefully pick up some questions at the end.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rob. Can I just ask you, like this slide that you had with the mix? I didn't really understand what's the purpose there. So you're saying mixing different types of sounds together in a mix, or what?
Yeah, a mix has to be thought out about as interactive and happening at runtime. So again, you have to put rules into the game rather than just sitting down and mixing content. You're doing this with rules and with like side chains and bus structures and things like that. But it's something that, like, when I first showed the image, that's usually how people think that, my sound is just going to reach the audience directly, or the dialogue is it's just going to play. There's not going to be anything getting in the way of that. But again, because there is so much going on, you now need all these systems to prioritize those sounds. Okay. And that is essentially the mix element there.
Okay, cool. Because when you said mix, I was thinking about the sound mix as when you look at the the door or something, but you're actually talking
Oh yeah,
about.
yeah. No, no.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
a good point. Yeah, like for video games, the early part of everything you do is in a DAW, but that's just the beginning of the pipeline of. Then you're in
right,
the audio engine with the content, and then the content needs rules to be able to tell it
right, right, right.
what important, what's going to
Yeah,
play, and so
yeah.
it's just thinking of that. Oh, now it's an
That's
interactive mix. Yeah,
right. Get it. I get it.
cool.
Great. Sounds amazing. Thanks a lot, Rob. So I think Christian, if you're there,
Yeah, I'm
awesome.
ready.
Then you can go. Just share your screen and off we go.
Yeah, so awesome. Great presentation so far. It's super interesting as well to see the perspective of how to do the different elements of the pipeline. So, but now I'm going to talk about something very specific, and that's right now currently not necessarily in the audio pipeline as I think it should be, and that's the audio-driven haptic. But first, let me see. Here, I'm Christian. I'm a senior sound designer at IO Interactive. I have a master's in game design and a bachelor's in sonic communication. I've been working in games for the last 7 or 8 years, and I love programming, board games, and nature, and of course my 2 girls. So, but today we are going to talk about some different elements about haptics. So first, we are going to talk about repro tactile feedback, what that means, vibrations and hearing, and then we're going into vibrations in games, then audio-driven haptics, vibration design, and lastly, real-world application of these concepts. So, repro tactile feedback. So hopefully most of you have felt that sensation, you know, the subtle vibration in your hand, or the feeling of a cell phone going off. And this has become part of our everyday life. And it's also pings like this that are the way that we interact with the digital world. We get it for doing actions on our phones, for knowing if we've done something correctly or wrong. And we also can tie a lot of emotions into vibrations. So you might imagine getting a text from a loved one. Then, of course, when you get that vibration, you get super happy. But you can also imagine that you are sitting super focused in your work, and all of a sudden there's like a phone is ringing on your table and having to pick that up. So from my perspective, that's the potential for a lot of emotions to come from vibrations. But I'll explain some more now. So studies have found that vibrations and hearing are super tightly coupled together. And ultimately, it's based on the same parts of the brain we're using to hear sounds that we're also using to understand vibrations. And so we can imagine that a lot of the things that we know about audio and sound can be used for vibrations as well. As I said before, emotional response, we know hearing a great piece of music can create huge emotions, but we also know that we've used sounds to react to the world around us to survive. And the same goes for vibrations. We're using our subconscious, we are using vibrations to orientate ourselves in the world as well. There are some differences though. You know, hearing goes from 20 to 20,000 hertz. Vibrations goes up to around 1,000 hertz. But in reality, if you look at this beautiful graph from Sony, you can see that there's a point around 400 hertz where the vibrations actually start to be interpreted as hearing. So if a vibration is around 1,000 hertz, then you will no longer feel it, you will sense it as an audible source instead. So generally speaking, up to 400 hertz, it makes sense to design vibrations. So before going into the more advanced stuff, I just wanted to inform you of how like vibrations have been done in the past. So usually vibration design has been part of the game design field, where the game designers together with direction will sit and decide where should we get feedback and how should it feel. And the focus there has been a lot about notification and game feel. So like shooting a weapon or getting a ping when an important moment has happened. It has traditionally been run by data-driven approaches, where you would get data from the game either directly from the programmers or maybe with an interface like Wise Motion source, where you can control and create vibrations. They have also been tasked to run these vibrations by quite crude rotary motors. As you see here on the Xbox controller, you have on one side a large rotary motor, on the other side a smaller one. And these two in combinations have been the source of the vibrations you could feel. But now some interesting leaps in technology has allowed us to go beyond these crude vibrations, and that's the DualSense controller that was released back with the PlayStation 5. The interesting thing about the DualSense controller is not only that it has two identical voice coils, but it's also that it's much more nuanced in the feedback. You can create meaningful feedback from around 40 hertz up to, again, as I said before, 400 hertz, where you can actually create a lot of different types of vibrations in that field. Another really important aspect is that it natively translates the audio input into a linear vibration. This means that now we can take the audio signal directly from a source and output it to controller, and the controller will do a vibration from that. So that's where audio-driven haptics come from. Vibrations designed using the data from the audio source. This allows us as designers to create much more nuanced vibrations than we could before. You could, of course, with the data-driven approach, use animation curves and different things to create very detailed haptics. But if you have to create a haptic that fitted to something very specific, like a large explosion, it would be very hard to pinpoint the exact moments where an audio source would have a sound and match that with a vibration. Here, it's a lot easier with the audio-driven approach, where you can simply map the audio over to the controller and bring the sound over on the controller. It also allows us to mix multiple different signals together as you would mix sounds. You can also now take multiple vibrations, combine them together. You can use DSP processing on them if you want, can compress them, equalize them, or maybe even add a reverb if you want to do something crazy with your vibrations. It also allows us to be a lot more flexible in the way we design vibrations, but I'll come back to that in a bit. So the vibrations that we are designing now are also very tightly linked to how we design audio. Uses the same parameters: time, timbre, amplitude, and spatiality. And the spatiality comes from the stereo field you have with the controller. You can actually, by adjusting the amount of vibration either side of the controller, you can get the feeling of a direction. And this is very useful when doing notifications about in-world stuff happening. But we also have the same design constraints when we're working on vibrations as we do with audio. We have to be very aware of fatigue in different types, like listening fatigue. You also have fatigue in your hands. There are some frequencies that are unpleasant to have a lot of, and there's also intrusive patterns. So if you have the same pattern repeating over and over again, the user will get very numb in their hands. And this is something we're used to avoiding in the audio design. By creating small changes in the vibrations, we can also disrupt the intrusive patterns. And this is very useful for us as designers. So now I'll talk a little bit about how we actually create the content of these vibrations. So there are three different main ways that I see that you can create vibrations. The first one is the direct way. That was what I was talking about before. You have a huge explosion, maybe there's some debris falling from the explosion, and you simply map that sound over to the controller. Then you are sure that the sensation of when the climax of the explosion hits is also when you get the vibration in your hand. So this is trying to mimic the reality of the sound being perceived. So you know that a vibration can come from touching a surface, but it's also from a high sound pressure. You can get a feeling of the vibrating in your body almost. Then we have the altered way, which is that imagine that it's not only an explosion, but maybe it's a torpedo hitting the side of a submarine. And you have this huge impact sound, and then you have the hull that is the hull of the ship that is breaking open and water going into the ship. So maybe it's not ideal that all of these different parts of the sound are mapped to the vibrations. That could be way too much and overpowered. So in the altered approach, you take the sound source as you have it, and you open it in your DAW or using some of Sony's vibration tools, and you alter the sound source to better fit the purpose. Maybe you want to make the main part of the impact more powerful, or you want to tweak some elements out or remove other elements. And then we have the bespoke way. The bespoke way is using something like this, the Geophone microphone, which is a surface microphone that records vibrations. It's used for like recording ground movement and observing things, but we can also use it in sound design to record sub-hearing content and vibrations. So using these tools, we can actually create vibrations that are one-to-one with what you experience in reality. So let's say you are creating the feeling of handling an item. So you have a gun and you pull back and reload, or you drop out the magazine. If you record that with a normal microphone, you can get some cool sounds, of course, and you can make that feel good. But when you're designing the vibrations, it's not necessarily the same as what you're hearing. So using this type of microphone, we can actually connect that directly to the item, and then you can get the feeling of the vibration coming directly to the hand and alter that and translate that over to the controller. Again, making it much more immersive and making the feel of the vibration more natural. But in the bespoke approach, there's also using synthesizers and other material sound designs to create vibrations that are over the top or unique or abstract. So using these different approaches, there's also, of course, a benefit and costs. So with the direct approach is almost free. If you have a great designed audio asset, then you can map that over to the vibration and get a lot of great feel. We also get the timing and the direct relation between what you are hearing and what you're feeling. In the altered approach, it's still relatively fast and doesn't cost much, but you can also make a much more clean vibration that you can use in your games. And we still maintain the timing from the audio. And then lastly, with this bespoke approach, it's of course way more expensive because you have to go in and record new material or create something from bottom up. But it's also a great way to create some content that is way more unique and interesting and can be specifically designed for the different type of controllers, because the audio-driven haptic is no longer reserved for only the PlayStation DualSense controller, but we can also do audio-driven haptics using middleware tools such as Wwise for the Xbox controllers, where you can still get away with the more crude rotary motors to create some more interesting content than you could with the data-driven approaches. So I'll just talk a little bit about the different areas of the game where we can support with these more advanced haptics. So we have the notifications and gameplay field that we have always supported with vibrations, but now we can also move on to more world building and storytelling elements. But first off, the notifications. Something that's super cool about having the fidelity of the audio-driven approach is that it's very easy for us to create different sensations for very similar type of notifications. So imagine here you're playing as Agent 47 and you are punching an NPC in the head. That will probably land you a nice and soft notification on the controller, like a big but soft haptics. But on the other hand, when the NPC punches you in the head, you might want to create a more harsh and snappy vibration that feels unpleasant for the players. This is, again, very easily done using the bespoke approach, where we can create content that fits the purpose of the notification. We can also use vibrations to communicate different gameplay states. Like you could have the scenario of being at low health, and maybe instead of constantly hearing your heartbeat, you could maybe feel some of that heartbeat instead, or you can communicate that the stress level of the game is intensifying and you have to react to something happening. You can now create subtle vibrations that communicate these state changes. And then you can also create more nuanced gameplay feedback. So like, as I said before, you have usually had like a vibration when shooting a firearm, for instance. But now we can actually go in and be way more nuanced in the different types of vibrations that you can feel. So I just threw in an example here. That's not the example. So that was a vibration of taking down an NPC. So in the old system, when we were using a data-driven approach, this vibration would just have been either a long, constant rumble, or maybe a short, punchy rumble. But here we could actually map it one-to-one with the motion of the characters in the game, and making it feel as when they were struggling, you were getting a vibration in your hand. And this would have been very time-consuming using a data-driven approach. But here it was simply looking at the animation and creating some content that fit with the Foley we had. So this was the example I was looking for, sorry. So when we designed the vibrations for Hitman 3, we went in and tried to figure out how far can we get from the old system and what can we do as interesting content. So here we have a few examples where you can definitely, of course you can't feel the vibration, but you can hear the vibration and maybe try to translate that into how it will feel for you on the controller. It's a big difference between firing a pistol and a sniper rifle. So there's a pistol vibration, a short, fairly high frequent, short burst of a vibration. You can of course fire that quickly and but it doesn't sound beautiful. Then we have a sniper rifle, or a shotgun, sorry. A much deeper vibration that has a longer tail. It also fits with the fire rate of a shotgun and feels very satisfying when you have the controller. And then the most abstract, to try to push the boundaries, we created different types of vibrations for the different type of sniper rifle. This one is very specific because it also uses the spatiality of the controller. So it actually starts in one side, goes to the other, and back to the first side again. And this creates a sense of a jerky movement in the hand, as if the sniper is a bit hard to control. So of course, this sounds a bit weird when you hear the audio from it, but you can still get a sensation of like the feeling of how this vibration would feel in your hands, hopefully. And then just to bring a few examples with here, I have some explosions. So the small, medium, and a large explosion example of how the vibrations sound. Great. So that was notifications and gameplay feel. But we also have a lot of possibilities to enhance the world building aspects of the games and the storytelling moments. We can use the vibrations to enhance and tell the stories of what we can't hear. So here, for instance, Agent 47 is walking out into the rain. And maybe the first time he walks out, you want the feeling of the rain hitting the hands. That we can create with the controller very easily and get the immersion of actually going into the rain without obstructing the gameplay or taking the focus away. We can also enhance the already audible events and make those feel more intense. Like imagine a truck driving by close to you, behind you as a player character. You don't necessarily want the big loud sound of the truck, but you can get the vibration and the feeling of something dangerous just passed behind me. We can also use the vibrations to communicate emotional states of the player. Maybe you can get the feeling of distress, of like, as I said before, with the sniper rifle, create some jerky movements in the controller, or communicate that the game is trying to tell you that you have a specific emotion, or you're disoriented, or maybe, as I said before, if you have been drugged or something like that, we put reverb on all the vibrations, and suddenly the controller feels very unresponsive and weird. And here it's again a way for us to help communicate what the game is trying to tell. And then lastly, we can actually also help enhance the cinematic feel. So just as an example, if you had a cinematic where the character walks over to this bank vault and tries to open it and figuring out where exactly when the pin drops, now you can't only hear it, but you can also feel the pin dropping and the safe opening. So we can create a lot of additional rewarding feelings for the players simply using these small haptics. So I think that's a super interesting topic that a lot of more games should explore. But now I have to move on with the real world applications, because I know a lot of you guys come from outside of game audio, and I think there's actually a huge potential to think about how we can use vibrations and haptics to help communicate our designs. We can use it to maybe enhance the believability of digital spaces. So imagine that you have been tasked with designing a new train, as if you know, like sitting on a train like this old one here in the picture. It's both audibly loud, you can hear a lot of background noise, but you can also feel the train vibrating. So if you put your hand to the window or on the table in front of you, you will feel the vibrations of the train. So I can see a scenario where an architect or an acoustician is presenting a new train version that is much more comfortable. Then you can actually put your investor in there with the controller in hand and show them how good it feels to be on this train. It's actually soft and calm, even though there are still vibrations, of course. You can also use them to improve the VR training. So training where you put on the headset and then go in and manipulate hardware to understand how to operate or to be a mechanic. Then now you can actually get the real vibration and the real feel of the objects themselves. Like I said before, like turning a dial or flipping a switch, we can control the actual vibrations happening and let the player or user feel that in their hands, or maybe when they put the hand up on the motor, you can actually feel what's wrong with the motor instead of just hearing it or seeing the problem. But of course, all of these vibrations also goes beyond just the controller. We have a lot of new things coming with mobile attenuators, headsets with attenuators, and body packs where you can get insane amounts of vibrations communicated. So I think this is also super interesting to look into. And before I wrap up, I just have one slide that we are, of course, looking for talent right now. And for me personally, we have this position for an audio programmer, which I think could be interesting for some of you guys, either working on Hitman or our new James Bond franchise or our even more exciting unannounced project. But if you're interested, you can go to the career page or write me afterwards. But thanks.
That was really good. Really good, guys. All of you. Very different, but definitely very informative. I know a lot more now than I knew before. All right.
Great.
So I have a bunch of questions here, but I don't want to be selfish because there's like 9 questions here to be answered. So I think we can just jump into that. So I'll just go to the first question. Is traditional foley common in gaming? Whoever wants to answer that, go ahead.
Yeah, it is, and the recording process is pretty similar actually. I think that the end goal is to sort of have Foley that feels as natural as it would, as Foley that you had in a movie or a TV post situation. The way that it's edited and I think that it's structured is just very different because, I mean, you'll have traditional Foley certainly for cinematic sequences, but once you're in game, you've really got to think about all these different surface types that the shoes may interact on. So you may have a Foley walker, have a list of different surfaces for like a gentle sort of creeping footsteps, and you'll get individual ones of those. Then you'll do like normal walking, or you'll do running. There may even be different boot types that the player is able to add or sort of change the way the character looks. So there's a modular approach to in-game Foley. So that can take a lot of time, a lot of planning, and a lot of resources for sure. But the end result, certainly the way that it appears to the player and the way that it's mixed in the game, is kind of the same thing. So yeah, like we're working a lot with like our own Foley department has a Foley stage, just as you'd have in sort of film, and also other kind of outsourced Foley people that we're working with as well, who again have Foley expertise from cinema, but are able to use those resources and those props for the materials that we need in games.
Awesome. Yeah, I actually also wrote that question, so I'm happy someone else asked as well. So next question is from Nicholas Jensen. Does it have to be a loop? Okay, I think this is for Simon. Does it have to be a loop, or can it also be based on, for example, the detailed geometric position state of the bridge?
Yeah, that's a good question, isn't it? It's a tough one. I think I would say it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be a loop. That's just what I would do, because I think that would cover a lot of, well, it could be almost like a loophole to getting away with making a not too detailed system right away. But I think, if you want to build a super detailed system for a bridge and trigger specific creaks at specific points, I think that sounds like a great idea. Yeah, sounds super cool.
So you can also, like, say in this place, trigger this sound, geometrically speaking, or
yeah,
based on physics or something. Or
yeah, I think why not?
right, cool.
Yeah, I think if that were the most important thing in the game, like that feature showed up everywhere, I think you'd want to put much more time into it. But if it was just some kind of background thing that happened occasionally, the amount of time that you would put into something like that needs to be less. So it just needs to, I think priority and how important something is plays into that question. But there's certainly no limit to how you can approach these things.
Right.
I would also like to add one thing. Yeah. I think also there's a danger of thinking realism over expression, because you can of course simulate reality, but often reality is super boring, and maybe different parts of the bridge is not super interesting compared to making a sound that is alive and transforms the emotions of the experience.
Right. Cool. Right, next question, because we still have a few. So, Rob, did the limitations of the tech early in your career inspire further the creativity in your sound design as limitations can do? Or was it mostly a source of frustration?
I think initially frustration for sure. A lot of that never goes away actually. But you're right in that sort of in the end, as you're working through those frustrations, I think you have to think differently. You're forced to think around something that you would normally be able to do in a DAW, for example. The limitations on the interactive in-game stuff really forces you to just like think of like in completely different ways, and like the ways you prepare your content, or the ways that you sort of hide things as well. Like you can sort of hide problems with other sounds, you can mask things, and the player won't notice these things. So there may be a lot of tricks that you need to sort of figure out to do that. And then at the end, you can kind of look back and go, well, it was actually good that we had those limitations, because it helped us to again sort of figure out what's important for the player really. But yeah, definitely, it's definitely general, isn't it? Yeah, it is. But I think now we're at the point where we almost have to self-impose the limitations in order to get to those sort of creative moments, particularly for content and for like more creative stuff. I think that's because you can just kind of do anything. But if you can set some odd like aesthetic limits, or you can even just sort of arbitrary limits, like let's only work with being able to play 8 sounds at any one time in the game, and you can limit that in Wwise and just try it out, and just try these things to try and sort of stimulate that limited world that you work in. It's interesting because it does go back a lot to like the history of recording and music, with the limitations of like 4-track and things like that, and how things had to be bounced, and then the work that the Beatles did and that Les Paul did with multi-tracking. I think that's an interesting place to look for similar sort of inspirations. Yeah.
Right, I totally agree. Sometimes you have so many choices that you don't know where to start, and then you lose all the time just playing around with things and not actually getting any work done. So it's also good to have some self-imposed limitations sometimes. All right, Anonymous is asking, if you were to build your own audio solution for a proprietary game engine today and exclude middleware like Fmod and Wwise, what would be the 5 most important features to make requests? That's a very technical question, I guess.
Yeah, that's a whole like 3-hour thing, isn't it? Like, but I don't know about 5 important things, but yeah, because the scenario is it's your own proprietary thing. The good thing is with that, you've got a team of programmers, like I was talking about earlier. So that it's immediately very, very good and very positive. And I think two things happen there. Is you need to think broadly and generically. Is this thing going to support multiple types of game, or is it very specifically going to support one kind of game, the game that we're working on? I think if it's a commercial sort of endeavor, you'd want to support like the most obvious features that most games need. But if it's like a very specific thing, which is kind of how proprietary engines and like systems developed initially, is to just support like open world, for example. That technology needed to stream things in and out was super specific. But I think I think being able to, the number one thing I would say is being able to swap out sound assets, like WAV file assets, in real time while the game is running, so that you're no longer having to quickly do a build step to hear the new content. I think being able to drop a WAV file into the tool and have it show up in the build in real time, it's something that a few people are achieving now with almost real time sort of things. But I think being able to do that, like have a sort of a pool of memory that's available to just continually add new stuff, would improve that iteration process. Because again, like deadlines seem to be getting shorter all the time. The amount of time that we have as audio people to react to things that are coming into the game seems to be getting shorter all the time. And so, yeah, and you see it in other areas of game development, like being able to add things in runtime. So that would be my number one addition. I'll leave it to the other panelists to perhaps name a few.
Do you guys want to say something?
I mean, I think one thing that I'm super hyped about at the moment is using a data-driven approaches as much as possible. I know I was just bashing about data-driven haptics not being the new kid on the block, but I think generally speaking, as much as we can get the audio to react to the game, that's the best. So instead of thinking about game as a movie where you see the final picture and you add sounds to that, we should just think about the features themselves. So the characters are movement, sure. Can we get the movement data and trigger the audio from that instead? The characters doing actions, that should trigger the audio directly. So somehow cutting away some of the middle where part actually, where a lot of this more systemic stuff is done by hand, it should be done by data. I think that would be my number one for a new engine.
Cool. Simon, do you want to say something, or should I move on to the next?
Yeah, I mean, I read this question earlier and I got scared because I didn't know what to answer. I think, like, if you're like starting from scratch and you have a game engine and it doesn't play back audio at all, I guess you'll want it to like stop and play and stop sound, right? That's pretty important. But then, one of the things I love about Wwise is also that, it's a good place to find an overview. And you have all of your sounds gathered in a place. You create hierarchies. You can create so many rules and like there's so many, functionalities that's just sort of given to you by default. So you really can do a lot of things without programming support. So but that's a bad answer. But good luck.
Yeah. So being more intuitive, maybe like something that you can be more self-reliant rather than depending on others or like not so much of a learning curve. Is that what you mean? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I have access to Wwise, I can create a lot of systematic stuff just inside the middleware. And all I need from the game is maybe a play event, like play now, maybe a few values for like the speed of the bridge or something. And then I can, with just like those two things, I can do a lot by myself. And if I would have to, a lot, what's that? That's like, swapping out assets, like making random containers, making sure it doesn't play the same sound again and again and again. Change the pitch a little bit for every time you play it. All these things that you would have to sort of build solutions for in the engine for every time you make something. Could get complicated. Could be hard to make something really good easily.
Right. Cool. I hope they take that comment as well. All right. There's another question for Rob. Broad question. What would you say are the main differences, or some of them, in the audio direction between a open world game and a more linear one? PS, is it okay to share your quality level table? It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's definitely okay to do that. It's so open world.
And
I think it's interesting. I've worked in both. Like Tomb Raider was a great example of a very linear with some limited kind of open areas, but mainly like a path-based experience where you kind of always knew what was coming next, and you always knew like what the environment is going to look like. You always knew if it was day or night. A very predictable, story-driven experience. And so over in open world, nighttime and daytime is a cycle often. So you don't know when the player is doing a certain thing, if it is going to be that time of day. You could even have like seasonal variation added into some of the open world titles as well. So there's so many like ballooning and mushrooming scenarios that you need to be able to cater for with your audio systems. That I think the amount of not generic's kind of the wrong word, but like more systemic audio that supports what you're seeing on screen is really important. There are a lot more systems for sure, and the questions about like the sort of direction and the vision, right? So I think covering all that stuff is kind of the first thing you want to do with open world, and then very often in open world there is a story like line or spine to the experience as well. So there is narrative, there is progression, and there is character development in open world. But it's this freedom element as well. So I think being able to think about all those systems and all that content and how that changes over the course of that story spine as well can be very complicated for audio. So there's a lot more to think about. But again, the experience for the player is they still need to enjoy that story, and they need to feel that progression. They need to understand what that character's going through. In a sort of in a third person sort of game. And then, but over in the Tomb Raider world, or the linear world, or whatever the kind of story driven world is, there's so much more thinking about very specific sounds and very specific triggers that like, for example, with Tomb Raider, if you're walking through a certain section of the Amazon jungle, and a certain trigger volume is reached and something happens, you always know that it's going to be essentially the same thing, like a jaguar sort of leaping out or whatever it is. You always know it's going to be the same jaguar. It's going to be the same animation type. There's not going to be much variance in that. So you can get a lot more specific about that stuff. So I think it just enables you more time as well to think about some of the emotional and some of the storytelling ways that sound is put together. And you tend to be able to use these like kind of dynamics curves. This sort of, you can map those experiences. You can go, oh, the really intense part of this map is the jaguar jumping out, so that's my 10 on this curve. So you can, before the player reaches that point, you can bring down some of the jungle sounds, and you can sort of make it more like anticipatory, so that when that jaguar happens, it's more sort of like impactful. So you can really develop this narrative shape to that experience. Whereas over in open world, you're systemic, you're recipe based, like it's combat or traversal, and that's kind of your dynamic shape. It's a much more anything can happen dynamically kind of shape to it. So you're sort of thinking about the same things, but once you get into the details of it, it's like really different stuff. So do I have a preference for working in either of those? Yeah, definitely more on the story driven side. Again, it's just more time, more predictability, and you can sort of seem to put more polish into it in a way. But there are a lot of obviously polished open world games. I think they just take a lot longer to make and think about. Yeah.
Awesome. We are not going to be able to go through all the questions, but I'm just going to, at least one for Christian, because there wasn't so many because they were in the end. But Christian, if I understood correctly, you don't use the data-driven approach anymore, and all your vibrations are designed on Wise Motion.
So just to clarify, Wise Motion is also using data, but no, I wouldn't say that we are not using it. But I think as a general rule of thumb, if you have a system, then you should use that system and not have multiple systems doing the same thing. So I think it would be yes, in the way that if you want a more traditional rumble, we can design it using a sound file as well. And then you can just trigger it from gameplay code as you would with the old rumbles. So in that way, I at least am arguing to move away from using the data-driven approaches and actually going in and using the audio directly.
Cool. All right, guys. I can't read all the questions because we have 1 minute left. So thanks a lot for this session. It's been very clarifying and very entertaining, actually. And thanks a lot for saying yes and for being here. I just want to say also that at the end of the call, there's like a 1 minute survey that people can fill out just so we get a better idea if people liked it and what they think we should do and so on. And I think that's it for me. But speak soon, and thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right. See you
Great.
guys.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.